Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we are going super deep on marriage.
Ooh, exciting.
It might seem straightforward on the surface, right?
Yeah.
But the philosophical history, wow, full of twists and turns.
It's complicated.
Still a huge source of debate today.
Big time.
So we're going to try to unpack the core arguments here.
And that.
And we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for this.
Great source. It's like the ultimate guide to marriage, philosophically speaking, at least. We're talking history, ethics, politics, feminism.
Queer theory, even.
Yeah, all of it.
And the goal here is to make these really complex ideas clear.
Break it down.
Maybe even find some surprising insights along the way.
I think we will.
And we're going to try to do all of that without drowning you in jargon.
Yeah, no need for that.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
What exactly is marriage?
Right. Like, what even is it?
It seems like it should be a simple question.
Yeah, you'd think so, but...
But our sources are saying it's anything but simple.
Oh, not at all. I mean, it's kind of a philosophical mess, if you really get into it. It's a legal contract, sure. It gives you a certain civil status.
But it's also often a religious right.
Right. Absolutely. And every religion has its own rules and doctrines about it. Then you've got the social practice of marriage, like what it actually means to be married in different cultures, different communities.
And that varies so much.
Enormously. I mean, we're not talking about small differences here. What marriage looks like, the practices, the expectations, it's just wildly different depending on where you are in the world, what time period you're talking about.
We're talking like polygyny.
Yeah, one man having multiple wives, totally normal in some cultures. And some societies have been surprisingly chill about extramarital sex, which might blow some minds.
I know. And, we often think of marriage as this super old, unchanging institution.
Yeah.
But the way it's officially recognized, that's evolved too, right?
Right, totally. I mean, the idea of a marriage license from the state.
That's actually quite recent.
Super recent. For a huge chunk of history, marriage was mostly about forging family ties. Who inherits what, making sure resources get shared properly. It was an economic and political thing, first and foremost.
That's a huge difference from how we tend to view it today.
Massive.
Right? Like it's all about love and companionship.
Exactly. And like you said, that idea of marrying for love, that's really new. It's a blip on the radar of marriage's long history.
Some ancient thinkers even warned against what they saw as too much love in marriage.
Excessive, yeah. They thought it could destabilize things. I mean, can you imagine that?
I know. It really shows how our cultural assumptions shape how we think about this.
Totally. And even the idea of consent, which we tend to see as so central to marriage today, that hasn't always been a given either.
True. I mean, forced marriages and child marriages tragically still exist in some places.
And even arranged marriages, which, can involve consent, but often the emphasis is more on things like caregiving and stability than romantic love.
So all of this leads to this fundamental question. Does marriage even have an essential definition?
Right. Is there a core to it? Or is it more like...
A bunch of different things that kind of resemble each other.
Like a family resemblance, yeah.
That's what some philosophers argue. Just like chairs. Right?
Yeah.
They all have the basic purpose of sitting, but there's no one specific feature they all have to have.
And if that's the case with marriage, if there's no fixed essence, then...
It changes the whole game.
Right. You can't just appeal to a definition to justify certain moral or legal obligations. Like, is monogamy essential to marriage? If not, you can't just say legal marriage must be monogamous just based on the definition.
Because the definition's up for grabs.
Exactly. So ultimately, this whole debate about defining marriage, it actually depends on our underlying ethical and political principles.
It's like we decide what marriage should be based on what we already believe.
Exactly. And to really unpack all of this, we've got to go back in time and see how different philosophers have viewed marriage throughout history.
Little philosophical time travel.
I love it. And as we go through these different views, some themes keep popping up.
Like what?
The relationship between marriage and the state, for one.
Huge one.
Then there's the role of sex and procreation.
Always a big one.
And, of course, the question of gender roles, which has been so central to how marriage has been structured.
It's fascinating to see how those themes play out in different ways over time.
It really is.
So let's start way back with Plato. His ideas on marriage in the Republic were, well, let's just say out there.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely radical, like abolish the private family radical.
For everyone.
Well, for the guardians, at least.
The guardian.
Yeah, the ruling class in his ideal society. He actually proposed communal wives and children for them. So no traditional families, no mom and dad, no knowledge of your biological parents.
Whoa, so how would that even work?
Temporary marriages would be arranged by the rulers at festivals, supposedly based on some kind of, eugenics program.
Eugenics.
Selective breeding, basically, trying to create the best possible offspring. And all the children would be raised communally.
That is intense. So why on earth would he propose something like that?
For Plato, it was all about unity and the good of the state. He thought private families created divided loyalties and that could weaken the state. So he wanted to eliminate private interests and extend this family-like loyalty to the whole community.
So it was a kind of extreme social engineering experiment.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around it today, but it shows how far some thinkers were willing to go to create their ideal societies.
Interestingly, our sources say Plato seemed to backpedal a bit on this in his later work, Laws.
He did. He allowed for private marriage in that one, but still with this focus on public benefit.
So it was always about the state for him.
In a way.
Now, Aristotle, Plato's student, wasn't having any of this communal family stuff.
Oh, no, he was totally against it.
He thought it was totally unrealistic, right?
He did. He thought Plato just fundamentally misunderstood human nature. The idea that you could transfer the love and loyalty you have for your own family to all your fellow citizens,
Aristotle said, no way.
he thought it was ridiculous. He believed the state actually arises from families, not the other way around.
So the family is the building block of society.
Exactly. And for him, the natural union of male and female, that's the foundation.
And from there you get families, and from families you get the state.
Precisely. And this idea, that society's stability depends on marriage and family, that's had a huge impact on political philosophy.
Big time. We see echoes of it in thinkers like Hegel, Rawls, Sandel, even today.
Absolutely.
But of course, Aristotle also had some, let's say, traditional views on gender roles within marriage.
Yeah, traditional and unfortunately really influential for centuries. He basically saw men as naturally suited to rule and women to be ruled.
Not very egalitarian.
No, not at all. He argued that men and women express their virtues differently. Men are courageous by commanding, women by obeying. And he thought that, this division of labor actually made for a strong marriage.
A very different understanding of strength that we might have today.
For sure.
So we've got these very different visions of marriage from Plato and Aristotle.
Two giants of philosophy.
And then, as we move into the Christian era, we see a big shift in the conversation.
Right.
The focus becomes all about sex and whether it's permissible.
And that gets tied very tightly to marriage.
So no more freewheeling discussions about different kinds of love and relationships.
Not really. It becomes very much about marriage as the sole context for morally acceptable sex.
And St. Augustine is really central to this shift.
Oh, absolutely. He was super influential in shaping Christian thought on marriage.
And for him, sex outside of marriage was totally off limits.
Totally. And even lust within marriage is something to be careful of.
It's kind of a downer view of sex, honestly.
Right. It's not exactly celebratory. But for Augustine, marriage wasn't primarily about sex anyway. He saw it as having three main purposes.
Which were?
Children, obviously. Fidelity between the spouses. And then this idea of sacrament.
Sacrament.
Yeah, marriage as a sacred bond, a symbol of the union between Christ and the church.
So a pretty high view of marriage, even if sex wasn't the main point.
Definitely. But it's interesting because Augustine recognized that marriage didn't magically erase lust.
So even within marriage, sex could be morally tricky.
Right. He basically said it depended on the intention. Sex for procreation, fine. Sex just for pleasure, even within marriage, not ideal. But still better than fornication, which is sex outside of marriage.
So marriage was kind of the lesser of two evils.
In a way, yeah. But because of this concern about fornication, he also said spouses had this duty to provide sex to each other.
The famous marital debt.
Exactly. It was about preventing temptation and maintaining fidelity.
Now, Aquinas, who came a few centuries later, he also emphasized procreation and fidelity as these core goods of marriage.
He did. He was building on Augustine, but he also brought in this idea of natural law.
Natural law.
The idea that there are these inherent moral principles that we can discover through reason.
Right. And for Aquinas, monogamous marriage fit right into this natural law.
Totally.
Yeah.
Because he thought it was the best way to raise children, and that was crucial for society.
He was pretty strict about sex outside of marriage too, right?
Yeah, he saw it as a serious sin because it could lead to children being born outside of a stable family.
He thought that could harm the kids.
And potentially society as a whole.
So very much in line with Augustine on that.
Definitely. But it's interesting because Aquinas also started to hint at a more companionate view of marriage.
Really?
Yeah. Beyond just procreation and fidelity, he talked about the partnership of a common life between spouses.
So more than just baby making and staying faithful.
Right. And that's seen as a kind of stepping stone toward the ideas about companionship that become really important later on.
It's cool to see how these different strands of thought start to emerge.
It really is.
Now, around the 12th century, we have Heloise, who offered a pretty different perspective.
Yeah, she really challenged the economic basis of marriage, which was still very dominant at the time.
She was pretty outspoken about it, right?
Oh, yeah, especially in her letters to Abelard. She basically said a woman who marries for money or status is just selling herself. She called it prostituting herself to a richer man.
Strong words.
She was not holding back. And what did she propose instead?
Love.
Love, yeah. Based on the idea of friendship, like Cicero talked about?
So not just romantic love, but this deeper, more intellectual and emotional connection.
Exactly. And for her, that was way more valuable than any kind of economic or social arrangement.
It's kind of a radical idea for the time.
Super radical. And it really raises this question that we still grapple with today. Can you have true love within a system that's so focused on obligations and economics?
It's that tension between love and the constraints of marriage.
Totally. And you see that playing out in different ways in the centuries that follow.
Like with Kierkegaard, right?
Yeah, he suggested that the very structure of marriage, with its rules and obligations, might actually be harmful to romantic love.
So he's kind of on Heloise's side there.
In a way, yeah. But then you have other thinkers who defend marriage, saying that commitment actually makes love stronger.
So there's this ongoing back and forth.
Definitely. And as we move into the early modern period, new ideas about equality and individual rights start to shake things up even more.
And the concept of contract becomes really important.
Huge. It really changes how people think about the foundations of marriage.
Like with Hobbes, for example.
Yeah, he argued that people are fundamentally equal, and that should apply to women, too.
So a break from that traditional hierarchy we saw with Aristotle.
In theory, yes. But then he kind of fumbles when it comes to explaining why men tend to have power in marriage,
He just kind of shrugs and says, well, that's how it's always been.
basically.
Not a very satisfying answer.
No, especially given his earlier claims about equality.
And Locke, who was all about government by consent, he also had some interesting views on marriage.
He did. He actually argued that marriage should be based on consent, just like the state. He rejected this idea of natural hierarchy.
So, sounds pretty progressive.
On the surface, yes. But then he throws in this caveat: if there's a disagreement within the marriage, the man gets the final say.
Because he's supposedly stronger and more rational.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Not very consistent with his whole consent thing.
No, and people called him out on it. Mary Estelle, for example, she was like, if all men are born free, how come all women are born slaves?
Mic drop.
Yeah, she really exposed the hypocrisy there.
And this tension between equality and the reality of inequality in marriage, that continues to play out.
Oh, absolutely. With Rousseau, for example, he still had this idea that women should be educated primarily to please men.
And Wollstonecraft came along and was like, nope, not buying it.
Yeah, she was a fierce advocate for women's rights in education.
So we see this struggle for equality playing out within these debates about marriage.
Totally. And then you have Kant, who brings in this whole contractual view of marriage, but with a twist.
A twist.
He was really concerned about sexual morality.
Right, Kant was always big on morality.
He thought sex outside of marriage was inherently objectifying. You're treating yourself and the other person as just a means to an end.
So, not cool.
No, not in his view. But he thought sex within marriage could be morally okay, but only under very specific conditions.
Like what?
He had this idea of a marriage right.
Marriage right.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. He basically said that in marriage, you give each other this right to lifelong possession of each other's sexual attributes.
Whoa. So marriage is like this mutual ownership contract.
Kind of, yeah. And he thought that somehow made it okay because each person is then reclaiming themselves through this exchange.
I'm not sure I totally follow that logic, but it's definitely a unique take.
Oh, for sure. It's super Kantian, very focused on rights and duties and this kind of abstract moral reasoning.
But it is interesting, right? Because even though Kant had some pretty old-fashioned views about gender and sexuality.
Yeah, definitely not progressive on those fronts.
But his emphasis on equality and reciprocity within marriage That's actually resonated with some contemporary feminists.
It has. And some advocates for same-sex marriage, too.
Really?
Yeah, they see in Kant's ideas this potential basis for arguing that all relationships, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, should be treated equally under the law.
That's a surprising connection.
It is. And it shows how these philosophical ideas can have unexpected ripple effects.
Now, Hegel, as always, tried to synthesize all these different threads into his own system.
Classic Hegel.
He agreed with Aristotle that marriage was fundamental to a healthy state.
Yeah, he saw it as this crucial building block of ethical life and citizenship.
But he also emphasized this idea of ethical love.
Right, which went beyond just fleeting passion or even just a contract.
So what did ethical love mean for Hegel?
For him, it was about this deep consciousness of your union with another person. A recognition that your individual identities are kind of intertwined, that you're part of this larger whole.
And he thought this ethical love could only be fully realized within marriage.
Yeah, he saw the formal institution of marriage as necessary for giving shape and structure to this ethical love.
It was about making it public,
Yeah.
making it real in the eyes of the community.
Exactly. And he thought that public commitment was what distinguished marriage from just a private agreement.
So we've seen how these different thinkers from ancient Greece to the 19th century have wrestled with the meaning and purpose of marriage.
It's a fascinating journey.
And as we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, the debates get even more intense,
Oh yeah, the stakes get higher.
especially as we start to really grapple with the ethical and political implications of different views of marriage.
Totally.
So let's dive into one of the central dividing lines in contemporary ethics. Is marriage a contract between individuals, or is it an institution with its own inherent moral obligations?
This is where it gets really interesting because the way you answer that question shapes your whole perspective on what marriage is and what it should be.
And what are the two main camps here?
On one side, you've got the contractualists.
Contractualists.
They basically see marriage as a promise or a set of promises between two people.
Like any other contract?
Right. So the terms in the contract, the obligations, those are all negotiable, at least in theory.
So if you and your partner want to have an open marriage, or you agree to split the chores a certain way, that's totally up to you.
Exactly. The state shouldn't interfere with those decisions as long as everyone's consenting.
Now, what's the reasoning behind this contractual view?
Well, one big idea is voluntarism.
Voluntarism.
The belief that all of our special moral obligations come from voluntary actions.
Like making a promise.
Exactly. So for contractualists, any special duties spouses have, those have to stem from their promises to each other.
So it's all about individual choice and autonomy.
Very much so.
And the other camp,
That's the institutionalists.
institutionalists.
They say marriage is more than just a private agreement. It's an institution with its own specific purpose and obligations.
So it's not just about what the individuals want.
Right. It's like becoming a doctor or a lawyer. You voluntarily enter that profession, but you don't get to pick and choose which ethical obligations you're going to follow.
So the institution itself sets the terms.
In this view, yes.
And that gets into some really tricky territory.
Oh, totally, because then you have to figure out what is the purpose of marriage and why can't individuals just decide for themselves what their obligations are?
Deep questions.
No easy answer.
Let's explore the contractual view a little further. What are some of the implications for things like extramarital sex and divorce?
Well, if you see marriage as a promise of sexual exclusivity, then having sex outside the marriage would be breaking that promise.
Which would be morally wrong.
From this perspective, yes.
But if marriage is just a contract between two people, couldn't they agree to change the terms?
In theory, yeah. If both partners consent, then maybe having extramarital sex wouldn't be morally wrong. It would just be a renegotiation of the original contract.
So open marriages could be totally fine.
From a purely contractual perspective, yeah.
But divorce gets tricky, right?
Oh, yeah. If you've promised to stay married till death do you part, and then you just decide to leave, that seems like breaking your promise.
Morally problematic.
Potentially, yes. But some contractualists would say, well, maybe there are certain conditions under which it's okay to break a marital promise.
Like if the other person is abusive or unfaithful.
Exactly. Or if it becomes impossible to fulfill the promise for whatever reason.
But what about the whole promising to love thing?
That's a tough one for the contractual view.
Because can you really promise to feel an emotion?
That's the problem. It seems like emotions are kind of outside our direct control.
So how can you be obligated to feel something?
Right. Some people try to reinterpret this promise to love as a promise to behave lovingly.
So do things that show love, even if you don't feel it at the moment.
Exactly. But that kind of undermines the whole romantic ideal, doesn't it?
It does. It becomes more about performing love than actually feeling it.
And that's not very satisfying, emotionally speaking.
But then you have this other interesting wrinkle. What if technology could actually allow us to control our emotions?
Like love drugs.
Yeah. What if we could take a pill that made us feel love for our partner?
That raises a whole host of ethical questions.
Big time. But it also challenges this whole idea of promising to love, right?
It does. Because if you can just pop a pill to ensure you feel love, does that make the promise meaningless?
It really complicates things.
For sure. Now, the contractual view also faces some other objections.
Like what?
Well, if marriage is just any set of promises, then why can't any two people who make promises to each other be considered married?
Good point.
What makes a marriage different from, say, a business contract or a friendship pact?
The contractualists need a way to draw that line.
They do. And then there's the bachelor's argument, which basically says marriage is irrational because there's a good chance it'll end badly.
A lot of marriages end in divorce, or people stay together but are unhappy.
Exactly. So why take that risk?
But people defend marriage, right?
Oh, absolutely. They say that even though there's a risk, the potential rewards are worth it.
Love, companionship, family.
All those good things. And they argue that the obligations of marriage can actually help you achieve those things.
By providing structure and stability.
Exactly.
Now, another objection to the contractual view focuses on this whole idea of voluntarism.
Right, this idea that all our moral obligations have to come from our choices.
And critics of voluntarism say that's just not true.
Yeah, they point to family relationships as an example. Like, parents have obligations to their children, even if they didn't choose to have them.
And children have obligations to their parents.
Right, and those obligations aren't based on any contract. They're just there because of the nature of the relationship.
So the contractual view has some holes.
It does. It can't fully account for all the complexities of marriage and family.
But it's still a really important perspective to consider.
Definitely. It raises a lot of important questions about individual choice and the role of the state.
So let's turn now to the institutional view.
Okay.
What's the basic idea here?
So instead of seeing marriage as just this individualistic contract,
The institutionalists say it's more than that.
right, they say it has a specific purpose. And that purpose defines what marriage is and what the obligations are.
And those obligations aren't up for negotiation.
Not really, no.
So what are the main types of institutional views?
Well, one big one is what's called the new natural law view.
New natural law.
It's a contemporary take on this very old idea of natural law, which we talked about with Aquinas.
Right, the idea that there are these inherent moral laws that we can figure out through reason.
Exactly. And the new natural lawyers, they apply this to marriage, and they say the essential purpose of marriage is procreation, yeah. They see it as the unique institution for conceiving and raising children within this lifelong union of both parents.
And they have a very specific idea of what that union should look like.
Yeah, it has to be between one man and one woman,
Mm.
because that's the only natural way to have children, they argue.
And they're pretty strict about sex outside of marriage, too.
Oh, yeah. They see any kind of sexual activity that's not oriented toward procreation within marriage as,
Morally wrong.
yeah, valueless even. And that includes same-sex relationships, contraception, masturbation, all of that.
And that all comes down to their view of what the good of marriage is.
Right. They say there's this unique marital good that can only be achieved through procreation within this specific kind of union.
And any sex that's not aimed at that good is seen as missing the point.
Exactly. And they would say it's actually harmful because it undermines the importance of marriage as this procreative institution.
So they see the state as having a role in promoting this particular view of marriage.
Oh, absolutely. They think the state should endorse and support this traditional model of marriage.
And they oppose things like same-sex marriage.
Yeah, they see that as a fundamental violation of the purpose of marriage.
But this view has faced a lot of criticism, right?
Oh, tons. I mean, one big objection is that it's just not effective in guiding people's choices.
Like, people are going to have sex outside of marriage, whether it's morally permissible or not.
Right. And trying to enforce this kind of rigid sexual morality just doesn't work.
And it can be really harmful, too.
Absolutely. It can lead to shame and stigma and all sorts of bad consequences.
Another objection is that the focus on same-sex marriage seems kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, if procreation is the essential purpose of marriage, then why not also ban contraception for straight couples?
Or divorce.
Right, those things also prevent procreation, so why single out same-sex relationships?
Seems inconsistent.
Very much so.
And there are also objections to this idea that non-marital sex can't have any value.
Yeah, a lot of people point out that sex can be good for all sorts of reasons. Pleasure, connection, intimacy, even just fun.
And those goods aren't limited to procreative sex within marriage.
No, they can be found in all sorts of relationships.
And what about infertile couples?
Ah, yes, the infertile couple problem.
If procreation is the whole point of marriage, then why allow infertile couples to marry?
The new natural lawyers have a response to that, but it's a bit of a stretch.
Let's hear it.
They basically say that even though infertile couples can't have kids, they're still engaging in the kind of sex that's oriented toward procreation.
So it's like they're going through the motions even if the outcome isn't possible.
Kinda, yeah. They're still having penile vaginal intercourse, which is seen as the natural way to procreate.
But that raises all sorts of questions about intention and the purpose of sex.
It does. And it also relies on this pretty essentialist view of gender and sexuality.
So it ultimately comes down to this idea that men and women are fundamentally different, and that difference is crucial to the purpose of marriage.
Right, and that's a very controversial claim, especially in light of all the ways that gender norms have been used to justify inequality and oppression.
So the new natural law view, while it offers a clear purpose for marriage,
It runs into some serious problems.
it just can't account for the diversity of human relationships.
And it ends up being really exclusionary.
Let's move on to the other main institutional view. Marriage as protecting love.
Okay, so this one's less unified. It's more like a family of views.
But the core idea is that the purpose of marriage is to protect and nurture a loving relationship.
Exactly. And different philosophers within this camp have different ideas about what kind of love we're talking about.
Does it have to be sexual?
Some say yes, some say no.
Does it have to be monogamous?
Again, different views.
But they generally agree that the point of marriage is to help create and sustain a loving relationship that's seen as valuable.
Right. And that generates certain obligations for the spouses.
Like what?
Well, one thing that's pretty uncontroversial is this idea of acting for the good of the relationship.
So not just focusing on your own needs and desires.
Right. It's about taking the other person's needs into account, making decisions together, compromising.
Being supportive.
Exactly.
But then there's the more controversial question of sexual exclusivity.
Yeah, that's where things get heated.
Because some people say that fidelity is essential for maintaining love.
They argue that sex creates a special kind of intimacy and that dividing that intimacy among multiple partners inevitably damages the relationship.
It can lead to jealousy and conflict.
Right. And they worry that opening up the marriage would just create more problems than it solves.
But others disagree? Right.
They say that monogamy isn't the only way to have a loving and committed relationship.
And they point to examples of open marriages and polyamorous relationships that seem to work quite well.
Yeah, they argue that as long as everyone's honest and communicative, you can have a strong relationship even if it's not sexually exclusive.
And some even say that monogamy can be stifling and limiting.
That it can actually prevent people from experiencing the full range of human connection and intimacy.
So it's a really complex debate.
Super complex, and there's no one right answer.
Now, this whole view of marriage as protecting love, it raises a bigger question too, right?
Yeah, even if we grant that